Every man I ever paid a wage to traded his hours for that money. Every single one. And when the hours stopped, the money stopped with them. That is not a complaint about wages. That is the mechanical description of how a wage works. Hours in, money out. No hours, no money. I paid my workers more than any other manufacturer in 1914, and I would do it again, because the wage I paid was not charity, and it was not generosity, and it was not what the newspapers called it at the time. It was a calculation, and the calculation revealed something about how wealth actually moves in this world that most of the men receiving that wage never understood. I want to tell you what I understood about it. Because what I understood is the difference between a life that accumulates and a life that resets at the beginning of every pay period forever. Stay with me. I am Henry Ford. I built the Ford Motor Company from a shed and 2 failed companies and a specific understanding of something most men in my industry refuse to see. The wage I paid my workers was the foundation of that understanding, not because paying it was noble, because building the system that could sustain it taught me something about money and ownership and the specific trap that a wage, even a generous one, eventually becomes. If you are living on a wage right now, I am not here to tell you the wage is the enemy. I am here to tell you exactly what the wage cannot do, regardless of how large it is, and what you need to build alongside it before the years that are available to you for building run out. Listen to this every day until the structure of what I am describing becomes visible in your own life. Low pay is not the trap. That is the misunderstanding that keeps most people from solving the actual problem. A man earning a modest wage looks at his situation and concludes that the problem is the size of the wage. He works harder, earns a raise, expands his spending to match, and finds himself in the identical structural position he was in before, just at a higher number. The number changed. The structure did not. The structure is the thing that determines the outcome across a life, and the structure of a wage, at any level, has one defining characteristic that no raise changes. Everything you receive converts entirely into consumed goods and services and disappears, leaving you with the same position at the start of the next period that you had at the start of this one. I have watched this operate across every level of wage I ever paid. The man earning $5 a day in 1914 spent the $5. The foreman earning $15 spent the $15. The senior engineer earning $50 spent the $50. The number was different. The structure was identical. Full conversion of income into consumption, every period, leaving nothing that compounded, nothing that accumulated, nothing that produced output without requiring the man's continued physical presence at the job. Every one of those men was one lost job, one serious illness, one factory closure away from having nothing, not because they had been irresponsible, but because the structure of what they were doing converted everything into consumption with no remainder. This is the wage trap, not insufficient pay, structural zero accumulation regardless of the pay level. And the specific reason it is a trap rather than simply a condition is that it becomes harder to escape the longer you are in it, because the consumption expands to match the income so reliably that the expansion feels like progress. The better car, the larger house, the improved quality of daily life that a rising wage produces, while the structural position underneath those visible improvements remains exactly what it was when the wage was smaller. A man I knew in the early years of the company, a machinist named Robert, who worked in the facility during the years when the assembly line was being developed, was among the best workers I had. Skilled, reliable, genuinely good at the specific work the line required, Robert earned the wage increases as they came. He bought a decent house in a decent neighborhood. He raised his children better than he had been raised. By every visible measure, his life was improving. By the structural measure, what he owned that produced income when he was not working, his position had not changed since the first day he walked through the factory door. He owned the house, which was an asset, but the house consumed money in maintenance and taxes and produced nothing. He owned the tools of his trade, which had no value without his continued health and presence. He had savings, which were genuine and which I respected, but the savings were a reserve, not a productive structure, and a reserve depletes without being replaced. When Robert's health deteriorated in his later years and he could no longer work the line, the savings carried him for a period, and then the savings were gone. His children helped. I provided what I could through the company's assistance programs. But Robert, who had worked with skill and reliability for decades and had earned every cent he received, ended those years with substantially less than his working years had suggested he would have, because the working years had not been building anything that continued without him. They had been exchanging hours for money, and the money had been consumed as it arrived. I tell Robert's story not to dishonor him. Robert was a good man and a skilled worker, and the failure in his situation was structural, not personal. He did what nearly everyone around him was doing. He worked hard, earned well, spent the earnings on a life that was genuinely better than the one he started with, and trusted that the wage would be there as long as he was. The wage was there exactly as long as he was. Then it was not there. And what was not there with it was the 40 years of building that could have been happening alongside the wage work. Here is what 40 years of even small parallel building produces. And I want to be specific because the general version of this principle sounds inspirational, and the specific version is what actually changes how you think about the next month. A man who puts aside a fixed portion of every wage not saved in the abstract, but directed consistently towards something that produces output without his continued presence, over 40 working years builds a productive position that his wage could never have built alone. The specific amount is less important than the direction and the consistency. 10% of a modest wage directed consistently into productive capacity for 40 years produces a structural position. 100% of a generous wage consumed entirely for 40 years produces nothing structural regardless of how much was consumed. The man directing 10% into production arrives at year 40 owning something that produces. The man consuming 100% arrives at year 40 owning only the consumption that is already gone. 40 years sounds distant when you are young and the wage feels adequate and the consumption it funds feels like the life being lived. It is not distant. It is the precise length of a working life. And the structural decision about whether any portion of the wage goes into production or whether all of it goes into consumption is made in the early years when the habit forms, not in the later years when the habit is visible in its results. The time to make the structural choice is now, regardless of where you are in the 40 years. Not because it is easy, because the alternative is to be Robert at the end of his working years, everything consumed, nothing remaining, the wage that was there exactly as long as he was. Now let me be specific about what productive capacity means, because this principle without a specific application produces understanding without change, and understanding without change is the version of this message that most people leave with. Productive capacity is anything you own that produces output without requiring your continued active presence. A business operation that runs with people you employ. A property that generates income from tenants who pay rent. A stake in someone else's productive operation that returns a portion of what it generates. These are the forms. The specific form matters less than the structural characteristic. It produces when you are not producing. The wage produces only when you are present and working. Productive capacity produces whether or not you are present. That difference, accumulated across a working life, is the entire difference between the man who arrives at the end of his working years owning something and the man who arrives owning only what the consumption left behind. Which specific form of productive capacity matters less than this question? The specific question is, what portion of the current wage, starting this pay period, goes into building some form of it? The portion does not have to be large to begin with. It has to be consistent, and it has to be prior to the consumption taken before the consumption has an opportunity to claim it, because consumption, given access to the full wage, claims the full wage. The structure must be established before the consumption encounters the income. Once the consumption has it, it is gone. Here is the exercise I want you to do before this message ends. Write down your current monthly income. Write down everything you currently own that produces output when you are not working. Be honest. For most people who are entirely on a wage, the second list is either empty or contains only a small amount of savings that deplete rather than produce. Then write the number that is the difference between where the first list implies you should be positioned and where the second list shows you are actually positioned. That gap is the structural cost of the wage trap operating in your specific life. It is not a judgment, it is a measurement. Measurements can be addressed. The gap that is not measured stays invisible, and invisible gaps do not close. Now I want to address the version of this message that most people hear and then dismiss, because I want to remove the reason for dismissal before it arrives. The version that gets dismissed sounds like, I am already working long hours and there is nothing left after the necessary expenses. This is the real condition of many people, and I am not going to pretend it is not real. The response to it is not to pretend the constraint does not exist. The response is to find the smallest amount that is genuinely extractable, not comfortable to extract, genuinely extractable, and to extract it and direct it consistently for long enough that the productive capacity it builds begins to generate its own return, which becomes available for reinvestment, which builds more capacity. Starting small is not a compromise. It does not have to be large enough to build something significant quickly. It has to be large enough to establish the direction and the habit. 5% of a modest income directed consistently into productive capacity is a different structural position than 0%. The difference between 5% and 0% is the difference between a direction and no direction. The direction is the thing that matters most in the early stages. The amount grows as the capacity grows, and as the consumption adjusts to the smaller pool that is available to it. Discomfort arrives with the adjustment. The consumption that was running at full income will experience the reduction of 5 or 10% as a real constraint. This is the period when most people abandon the direction, not because the extraction is impossible, but because the constraint produces a feeling of having less than before, and having less than before feels like the wrong direction, even when it is the right one. It is the right one. The constraint is temporary. The productive capacity is permanent. The feeling of having less during the adjustment period is the specific discomfort that buys the structural change. Pay it. The alternative is rob it at the end of 40 years. Built into the wage trap is a ceiling. This is the part most people do not think about until they have hit it, and I want to describe it clearly because it is the second reason the trap is more serious than simply the immediate structural problem. That ceiling is the limit of what the wage can ever produce, regardless of how much the wage rises. The wage is bound to the hours you can physically provide. The hours you can physically provide are finite, and they decrease over time as health and age reduce the capacity to sustain them. The man on a wage has a productive ceiling defined by the maximum hours he can provide at the best rate he can command. That ceiling does not rise with time, it decreases with it. Productive capacity has no equivalent ceiling. A well-built productive operation does not require more of your physical presence as it grows. It requires the building of systems and the employment of people who contribute their own hours to the production. The return grows with the operation, not with your physical presence. A man who has built genuine productive capacity over 20 years can, in principle, produce more at 60 than he could at 40, not because he is working more hours, but because the capacity he built is producing more output. This is the specific inversion that separates the life of the wage earner from the life of the producer. One system's output decreases as the man ages. The others can increase. Most men spend all 40 years of their working life in the system whose output decreases, not because they prefer that outcome. Because the system whose output can increase requires something to be built during the working years, and the working years are consumed by the wage work that leaves little space for building anything additional. This is the mechanism of the trap. The wage consumes the time that building requires. The building that does not happen during the wage years cannot be retroactively done after the wage years end. The time is the resource. The time spent entirely in wage exchange is the time not spent building. This is why I said at the beginning that what I understood about the wage was not charity and not generosity. When I paid $5 a day in 1914, I was not giving my workers more than they needed. I was giving them enough that the financial anxiety that had been consuming part of their productive attention was removed. A worker who earns enough to live without financial fear is a worker whose full attention is on the work. The quality of the work improved. The throughput improved. The turnover dropped. The $5 wage paid for itself many times over in operational improvement. But what I also understood, and what I did not broadcast because it was not something people wanted to hear from the man paying the wage, was that the $5 wage still had the ceiling. It was still a system in which the hours produced the income and the income consumed was gone. My workers, who spent every dollar I paid them, however responsibly and however well, were still in the trap. Better housed, better fed, better equipped to live a decent life, genuinely and meaningfully better, but still structurally in the position where the income stopped when the hours stopped. What I am giving you now is the warning I could not give them then, without it sounding like something other than what it was. Build something alongside the wage. Build it small, if that is what the current situation allows. Build it consistently, because consistency is what the wage depletes and what the building requires. Do not wait for a larger wage to begin, because the larger wage will be consumed just as completely as the current one, and the building will still not have happened. The building begins with what you have, now, directed consistently into something you own a piece of. Second exercise. Write down one specific form of productive capacity that is realistic given your current situation, your current skills, and the specific small amount you identified in the first exercise. Not the ideal form, the realistic form that is actually available in your current life. Then write one specific action you can take in the next 7 days that moves you one step toward owning a piece of that form. One step, 7 days. That is the beginning of the structural change, not the completion of it. The beginning. The beginning is the only part that has to happen in the next 7 days. Everything else follows from the beginning having happened. Every year you spend entirely in wage exchange is a year the productive capacity does not grow. Every year you spend in both wage exchange and productive building is a year the productive capacity grows by whatever small amount the building produced. The cumulative difference between these two paths over 20 or 30 years is not marginal. It is the difference between Robert at the end of his working life and the man who arrives at that same point, owning something that continues producing whether or not he is present to drive it. You know which outcome you want. The wage trap will keep you in the wrong one as long as the full wage goes into consumption. It will release you the day you redirect a portion of it, consistently, into something you own. That day can be any day. It can be the day this message ends. Listen to this every day until the direction you are building in feels as natural as the wage work does.